And this week we looked at micropolitical theory by way of contrast to the theories of realism and liberalism that we've looked at in the previous weeks. So, based on this, the learning outcomes should be that you are familiar with the idea of what micropolitical theory might be and what that means for international relations. To use this theory to critically compare to realist and liberal interpretations of the discipline, and also to think about how you can develop research skills in the context of what we've been thinking about. So thinking about your critical thinking and starting to think about how you're going to format your research proposal. The lecture is outlined in the following ways. In class I gave a brief overview of the second assessment, but in this one I'm going to be focusing first on the previous theories and then looking at micropolitical theories, looking in particular at practice, emotion, and lived experience. And then within that, moving toward the discussion of what narrative international relations is becoming. So, moving on to the lecture. Here we begin with a definition of what micropolitical theory is, and I'm drawing on the works of Solomon Steele, who published an article in 2016, which says that micropolitics are those features of social life that often slip through our normal schematic or binary frameworks. So it's the aspects that aren't necessarily covered in realism and liberalism. It includes, but does not fully capture, the idea of politics of the small, as opposed to politics of the large. So all of a sudden we are opening up and looking inside the state. What they go on to say is that micropolitics is defined not by the smallest of its elements, but by the nature of its mass. And they say, to understand what this means, we have to look at various things, in particular sensation, resonance, movement, and flow. So, when we're thinking about micropolitics, we don't want to stay situated within these ideas, but we want to think about what escapes from them, what overflows, and what exceeds them. So we're starting to talk about things that aren't always talked about in international relations. Well, why do we do micropolitics? What does it offer IR? Well, there is an idea that interstate war is decreasing. So micropolitics is shifting that focus. It asks us to think about violence and not necessarily war. And when we open up the discussion to violence, we can look at individuals and we can look at groups. So we are moving away from a focus on the state. This opens up new sites of investigation and discussion. So we're allowed to talk about things that perhaps 5 years ago we weren't necessarily talking about. Why do we do this? Well, many scholars, Steele and Solomon in particular, say that after 2000, the nature of international relations and the nature of the international dynamic has changed. And here they talk about it with reference to 9/11, 7/7, and the financial crisis in 2008. Now, we do need to be careful that micropolitics might just be a reaction to various international events, and we need to guard against what that might be. And here are authors, in particular Miriam Futu, have talked about what is the new materialism in the context of this critique. So, we are now starting to talk about bodies or embodiment, and this is what allows us to talk about emotions and the everyday practices of international relations, whereas before these were never really discussed. Micropolitics also argues that it helps address some of the shortcomings of international relations theory. So the idea that it talks about things that aren't necessarily captured in the grand theories. So it also directs scholarly attention away from the humanity of politics. So they are asking questions, where are the people in all of this? And what impact do our practices in international relations have on the people who are living them out? How do we study this then? Well, just like liberalism and realism had their ways of looking at the world, micropolitical scholars suggest we look at 3 things in particular: emotions, practice, and lived experience. And that's what we're going to focus on in the rest of the lecture. Now, emotions in international relations might be a new idea, but feminist scholars were talking about emotions as early as the 1980s. And here I would point you to the works of Alison Jaeger. In particular, her work on feminist epistemology talks about the role of outlaw emotions and what role they have to play in research design and development. And she says that emotions can be a source of curiosity and they can engage our imagination. And this, in turn, allows us to study what might otherwise not be studied. And it's this idea that we're channeling within micropolitics. Why was this feminist thinking so important? Well, it really does challenge what we call methodological elitism. The idea that some voices are excluded and are marginalized and aren't allowed to tell their stories. When you open up the idea that other people have a story to tell and that those stories are important to the discipline, then the status quo iterations of international relations can both be challenged and they start to change. The idea of emotions in international relations specifically comes about in the works of Roland Bleecker and Emma Hutchinson, and they published a seminal article in 2008, and it's on your course reading pack. When they write this article, they have two particular goals, and they're related to each other. They want to explain the absence of emotions in world politics and wonder why this is the case. And they want to put forward different ways that we might be able to actually improve upon this and start talking more openly about the role of emotions. They say that there is an important discussion to be had. They do draw on the feminist discussions of emotions, and they turn to the role of political psychology to show where emotions actually can be located. And in doing this, they look at the relationship between emotions and identity and how we come to know. And here they reference the work of Sarah Ahmed and Martha Nussbaum. But they do this so that we can have a new form of interpretation on what world politics might be. And in class, we talked about the ups and the downs, so the positives and the negatives of an interpretive approach. We then went in to talk about the way that images can be used as a representation of IR, and we talked about it with reference to pain and how we saw the torturing of Abu Ghraib prisoners come about and what that meant for a wider international conscience. We then moved on to look at the role of emotions in IR through the work of Pablo Picasso in his Guernica photo, and you were offered a YouTube video that allowed you to help with the interpretation of what you can see, but also what you might miss the first time around, and what the messages are concerning war, pacifism, and the use of state violence more broadly. We then went on to talk about practice, and I offered you a definition from Wilson from 2017, who draws on the idea of Bourdieu. And here, practice is defined as the habitus or background within which people operate. It looks at seemingly mundane or banal, recurrent and multiple activities and routines that we are all engaged with in our everyday lives. And it is these reoccurring activities that go on to shape the form and the flow of our individual and social lives in both space and time. And this ties back to the definition that Solomon and Steele were talking about in terms of referencing what flow might mean. It also asks us to think differently about space and time and wonder if the linearity that comes about through realism liberalism is actually the best representation of what happens in world politics. She then goes on to say that the activities of our everyday lives are replicated many times over, and by many different people on a daily or a regular basis, and we need to bear that in mind. And it is this repetition and this ongoing repetition that shows how events and practices become normal in the discipline. We can find studies of the everyday everywhere. They are partially concerning with bringing the invisible to light. So again, this goes to the excavation of silences referenced by Solomon and Steele. They're also open to critique in the examining of power relationships and what power relationships do to the various practices that we find within the discipline of international relations. They're also concerned with understanding how everyday practices are also performative. So what do we get out of doing some of these things? Now, if we focus in more specifically on habitus, we get this idea that it is created through a social rather than an individual process, and things like Occupy London, #activism, or even the Black Lives Matter campaign going global are really good indications of this type of idea. You get this existence or this creation of patterns that seem to be enduring and transferable from one context to another, but they also shift in relation to specific contexts and time. And here again, it goes back to the excavation of power. Black Lives Matter is a particularly helpful indication of this type of argument. But we have to bear in mind that a habitus is not fixed or permanent and can be changed under unexpected situations or over a long historical period. So nothing is permanent. Finally, we turn to the idea of lived experience. And within lived experience, we have something that Roxanne Doughty has called the voice. Now, she publishes something in 2004 that says that students or scholars are trained to be empirical and causal and attain a specific end. And this might actually be one of the reasons why the excavation of emotions in world politics is actually quite hard, because the discipline doesn't train people to look at this. And it also links back to the idea of methodological elitism, the idea that not everybody is allowed a voice and certain voices count more than others. So we have to go back and find those voices that are otherwise unheard. So how do we find a voice? How do we learn how to listen, and who do we listen to? And we talked about this in the context of the book Integrate Silence by Eva Saulitis. This in essence, is a version of reflexivity. And this is where our lecture in class ended. The idea to be reflexive actually ties into the assignments that you've been doing, to locate where you are in the research process and think about how your own emotions, your own emotional or your outlaw emotions, like that suggested by Alison Yeager, push you to study the types of things that you choose to study. So these are some of the questions that you can be asking as you're going forward with your research project. Why did you choose your topic? What does your topic mean to you at a personal level? And asking these questions will give you a different insight to, say, a realist or a liberal interpretation of the topic that you've chosen.